So where Americans are hampered is by an educational system that is really selectively and purposefully includes and excludes. It primarily includes a narrative that supports white supremacy, and it excludes the history and experience of Black, Indigenous, Latinx folks. When it does include them, it's an edited version of history that's not authentic in all cases and accurate or based in reality.
For the time being, at least, I think there are certain things that we can do at home and other things that are just not possible to do so. And what I think the last year has shown us is, kind of made that abundantly clear, let's say. Lisa?
Yeah, this might be a good opportunity to segue into the next topic we really wanted to explore, particularly when we talk about working across cultures. And if we could take a deeper dive with you, Jonathan, on what we think are probably the two most important tools when it comes to cultural awareness and cultural intelligence, we look at communication and connectivity. And from the standpoint of the pandemic, we have probably been more isolated than ever before as a consequence of the pandemic, relying more on Zoom meetings, working at home. Let me ask you first, how has this impacted the American business professionals' ability to communicate when it comes to the more strategic aspects that require higher level communication, higher level collaboration?
Well, I think, on the positive side, it's leveled the playing field between corporate and field employees, the geo-dispersed employees being the field. Corporate employees have less advantage of proximity and distance now. Advantages in, for example, building trusted relationships. People would argue it was even easier, and the data shows it, easier to get promoted if you work closer to your boss. And whereas if you're, out of sight, you're out of mind potentially. So on the downside, there's less context to your point about the cross-cultural work. And it's easier for misunderstandings to occur. And that's going to create inefficiency, right? Email and texting and instant messaging are the lowest forms of contextual communication. So it plays to the advantage of low context cultures where they can be direct and to the point, but high context communication will really suffer in this environment. It requires eye contact, body language, and careful concentrated listening, because with high context cultures, there's a lot said in the eyes, in the body language, in the inflection, and it's just harder to read, and especially if you're not in tune to that. And there's less opportunities, I mentioned a minute ago, for informal collaboration, problem solving, and that's hampered. There's no hallway conversations, no going for a quick coffee to talk about an idea or run through a problem solving, lunch meetings, or just taking a walk together. That really is a constraint.
Do you sense, Jonathan, for the American companies and the business professionals that are working overseas, that are working all over the world, do you think they'll return to traveling again? Because we'll talk about another important aspect in just a moment, but I think one of the reasons why Americans have made strides in overcoming cultural barriers is they've realized the importance of being in the country, spending time on the ground, learning about the people they're doing business with. Do you think that Americans will go back to traveling when it comes to international business, or will they rely more on this kind of Zoom and video conferencing, things like that?
Yeah, I think it'll spin up again over an extended period of time and reach levels close to or at the prior levels. It's going to take some time, but it'll happen over the next, let's say, 5 years. Among employed adults in the US who are not working from home all the time and are interacting, at least in person, at least some of the time with others at their workplace, there are concerns about the virus, of course, and they, as I mentioned earlier, they differ by race, gender, and ethnicity. Women are 60% more likely than men to be at least somewhat concerned about being exposed to the virus. And Black and Latinx are more concerned. Black employees 70% more concerned, and Latinx 67%, compared to white workers at 48%. So, you know, Black and Latinx workers are less likely than white workers to be very satisfied with the measures that their workplace has taken, you know, to protect them from being exposed. So it's super interesting data from Pew Research.
You know, I want to follow up on something else you said that's very interesting, and maybe we could, for a few moments, bring our discussion more closely to Europeans and Americans that work together. I appreciated your comments about, you know, the new business etiquette of not shaking hands and kind of changing that. They did a poll recently in Italy, and it was very interesting. They asked Italians, what is the one thing you can't wait to do again after we are over the pandemic? And the number one thing that Italians wanted to do was hug. It's a culture of connectivity, personally, but also in business. It's very common for men to kiss, to hug, it's just a culture of connectivity. It's interesting when we think about, as we reopen borders and re-engage in the business community, how that dynamic of connectivity is going to play out across culture, where you have Europeans that are going to want to try to go back to those old traditions, and I sense maybe Americans are looking at a new way of approaching this. Just kind of curious, I think a lot of people that follow us are interested in what the new etiquette might be.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think certain interpersonal communications are going to change. I think, you know, I mean, I've had instances where you know, people are so much in the habit of reaching out and shaking your hand. And I was you know, coming across somebody I was introduced to, and the individual reached out and put their hand out, and I was like, oh, you know, stand back. So I think that's going to change, and we're going to have to figure out, you know, how people are going to greet each other in the future. I think it's going to culturally be very kind of awkward initially of knowing what the right thing to do is. You know, when I traveled to the Middle East, and particularly like Egypt and Saudi Arabia, you know, there's a nice way of greeting people, which is just putting your hand on your heart. And I love that. I think that's a great way to greet people, and maybe a slight bow, you know, to show respect. I think that's a wonderful tradition that I'd love to see picked up around the world.
One of the things that Europeans tended to struggle with is when, you know, they would meet for a business lunch or they would have coffee. You know, it's the American business culture to talk work, to talk business, but to the Italians and a lot of the Europeans, it's a business relationship that's first built on trust and connection. I want to get to know you. I want to spend time with you. We're not going to spend lunch talking about work. We'll do that later. If there is a disconnectivity as a result of COVID, where there's going to be less traveling, what do you see, or how would you advise clients to overcome some of these barriers so that we can start building those bridges again? Because I kind of go back to the biggest strides Americans have made is by being in the country of origin and interacting directly. I think there's no substitute for it, but I'm really curious how you see this playing out if there is going to be a paradigm shift as a result of the pandemic.
Yeah, I think first, you know, there'll be more work, as we said, that'll be over VTC, video teleconference, less travel. So I think the first thing is being time zone sensitive, finding out what times work for best for both of you. And if you're the one setting up the meeting, default to you taking the evening call, for example, and then switching off future meetings if that works best for both people, of who's going to take the meeting that's kind of outside traditional work hours. And next, I think there's going to be an important point of being more sensitive to assuming you don't understand what they're saying, if you will, or that you missed something. So not just assuming you got it the first time, asking more questions, clarifying questions, paraphrasing back, to make sure you heard and ask, did I understand you correctly? And ask for examples to add context to the information that's shared. And overall, on an ongoing basis, take time to understand the general tendencies of that culture. Take time to get to know the person as an individual, because not everyone follows the general tendencies of the culture, right? And know whether you're working with a person, as I said earlier, is like high context or low context, because if they're high context, relationship building first, then task. And if they're more task oriented, focus on that and then the relationship. And knowing if the person's more, status oriented, so they're maybe less likely to give feedback directly or to you with other people in the room, or they're more, collaborative and egalitarian. Are they more an individual or are they more collectivist? Just all those cultural styles. Are they more risk oriented or certainty oriented? Some of the work that's been done by, Geert Hofstede and a great book out there is Software of the Mind, where he goes through these different cultural differences and their styles. And of course, we'll talk later about like some of the tools that are out there to grow your cultural intelligence as well. But I think that's, I think it's going to be a more important, because you're not going to have as much time on the ground, if you will. So you're going to have to invest in other tools to grow your cultural intelligence.
I want to follow up, which I think is a natural kind of topic that flows from what our discussion has been centered on, and that is the topic of ethnocentrism, which is a big issue that Western countries and Western culture have long been ethnocentric. The more powerful a country is, the more that country mirror images its values on other parts of the world, and Americans have done this across political ideology and throughout various times in our history. And we see this as a continuing issue and quite frankly, a barrier to deepening cultural awareness. What are your thoughts in general about American ethnocentrism and what impact, either positive or negative, you see the pandemic as having on this dynamic?
America is not one culture. It's made up of many, many microcultures split out by hundreds of dimensions of diversity, of race, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, gender expression, ability. I mean, it just goes on. Geography, education, political affiliation, family status, language. I mean, there's many, many different definitions and or aspects to it. So I'm not a fan of the term kind of American ethnocentrism, just as Europe is many, many cultures, of course, as well. But people can be ethnocentric for sure, and they are in many cases in judging others by their values. And our values in America are as diverse as anywhere on the planet. And as well, I think it's human nature to judge others by our own values and understanding of how the world works outside of our norms and values and social structures. It's a very challenging endeavor. It requires a lot of commitment to learn, a curiosity and a desire to understand and become culturally intelligent. And it's also suspending judgment, right? And try to see the world through someone else's eyes and experience. So where Americans are hampered, where we are hampered is by an educational system that is really selectively and purposefully includes and excludes. It primarily includes a narrative that supports white supremacy. And it excludes the history and experience of Black, Indigenous, and Latinx folks. When it does include them, it's an edited version of history that's not authentic in all cases and accurate or based in reality. I wasn't taught about the Tulsa massacre in Oklahoma in school. I wasn't provided with an accurate story of the Black Panthers. I mean, if you watch Forrest Gump, the movie, you get a very skewed view of the Black Panther movement, and it's just not, true about their leaders, their mission, and their goals. And that's true for the majority of the civil rights movement in the United States. I didn't learn about the brilliance of Fred Hampton, nor even knew his name until years later. And that was because of flaws in the American education system, which really still to this day need to be addressed. Now, according to the US Census Bureau, only 20% of Americans can speak 2 or more languages, compared to 56% of Europeans. So, and experts estimate that half of the human race is bilingual. And this is because of ethnocentrism in the US. So I believe that English is, the belief that English is all we need, that others are expected to learn our way, and command of the English language is viewed as the premier language. But why is that so? Why not Italian or French or German or Spanish or Hebrew or Chinese, right? Well, we can't say Americans are or not culturally intelligent, because that would be a massive generalization, and some are and some are not. But we're hampered by our education system and generally an ethnocentric view that our way is the right way, the other way is the wrong way.
No, those are some great observations and insights. Let me ask you this, is specifically, again, coming to Europe and America, because this, I know, is something that at times can be frustrating for Italians and Western Europeans. Do Americans, in your view, do they really see themselves as culturally diverse from Europeans? Because a lot of times Americans have the idea, my grandparents were from France or Italy or Germany, we're just like each other, we're both Western culture. And there's a sense that sometimes Americans don't appreciate or respect that there are different business cultures and practices between Europe and America. So we're curious what your perspective is on that.
Sure. Again, I don't think we can put all Americans into one bucket. I think some do and some don't, and some never think about it. It also depends on how each person defines culturally diverse. Culture is multidimensional, as you know, and each person has their own definition. It's language, it's music, it's food, art, religion, customs, even things like dress and hairstyle, sports and games. So I think it really does vary across the culture here.
Let me ask you one final question, and I'm going to hand you back to Raj. What advice would you give for both Europeans and Americans on how we all can overcome this ethnocentric bias, whatever it happens to be, so that we can connect and understand each other across culture?
Yeah, I think of kind of 7 different things. I think spending time getting to know people from other cultures, people different from yourself. Malcolm X talked about, inviting the people who are in your kitchen, right? In the most intimate place, people that spend time in your kitchen. Who is in your kitchen? Who is spending time in your home that you can get to know at a deeper level, right? And deep dive on the friendship and understanding them. And of course, travel when we can, as you mentioned, is huge. Reading books, magazines from other cultures, watching international films, listen to music of other cultures. It's very easy to learn a new language as far as the tools that are out there, like Duolingo, which is free and online, and there's many others out there. And asking lots of questions, including the why questions. You have somebody new on your team, and set up a one-on-one with them over Zoom, or when we can be back in the office, grab a lunch with them to learn about their culture and the foods, and ask for recommendations about what they like to do and where they like to do it. So I think those are kind of the 7 things I think about how you can overcome ethnocentrism and become more culturally intelligent.
Okay. All right, Raj, back to you.
Okay, so we're going to get onto a very interesting and sometimes frustrating topic to talk about, and sometimes even to understand.
In my opinion, we have a race war underway, and white people can choose to ignore it or pretend it's not happening most of the time. So we're talking about Black people, brown people, Indigenous people, people with disabilities, and frankly, anyone that doesn't fit into the paradigm of white supremacy, and that can be interpreted to be challenging white power and white supremacy in this country.